Good evening, welcome to tonight's program of the Commonwealth Club of California. This program is being held in association with the Asia Society of Northern California. I'm Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the club and the chair for tonight's program. It gives me very great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished guest, Dr. Ruth Shapiro, founder and chief executive of the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society. She is a board member here at the Commonwealth Club, the author of the new book, Pragmatic Philanthropy, Asian Charity Explained, and my very good friend and longtime colleague. As enormous wealth continues to be created in Asia, the region's ultra-high net worth individuals are turning their interest to philanthropy. But their path continues to manifest itself quite differently from that in the United States and Western Europe. Today, Dr. Shapiro will draw upon exclusive interviews with ultra-high net worth individuals and case studies of successful social initiatives contained in her new book to provide insight on why and how Asia's traditional and newer philanthropists are giving. Dr. Shapiro is the founder and chief executive of the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society. That is a nonprofit incorporated in Hong Kong in 2014. In addition to Pragmatic Philanthropy, Dr. Shapiro edited The Real Problem Solvers, a book about social entrepreneurship in America, which was based on programs she organized here at the Commonwealth Club. Dr. Shapiro is a regular speaker on issues related to Asian philanthropy, to social innovation, and social entrepreneurship in Asia. She holds a doctorate from Stanford University and a master's degree from Harvard University, as well as one from George Washington University. I'm also pleased to say that today Dr. Shapiro will be in conversation with Jack Wadsworth, co-chairman of the Asia Society of Northern California and former chair of Morgan Stanley Asia. Please welcome our distinguished guest, Ruth Shapiro, and our distinguished moderator, Jack Wadsworth.
Well, thank you so much. I am honored to be here at the Commonwealth Club. I love your new building. As a co-chair of the Asia Society, I will say I'm slightly jealous. But we're delighted to be your guests here today. And to be on the podium with Ruth is fun for me. We've known each other for a long time, and we have traveled lots of Asia together in various contexts, and it's just so appropriate that the subject, I think now, of her passion and a big topic in Asia is philanthropy. We all appreciate and I think recognize the huge importance that philanthropy has played in America, and in a way, my time in Asia, and particularly in China, I just see so many parallels. But that's about all I'm going to say tonight, because you want to hear from Ruth. So I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to behave myself and not talk too much.
No, please don't.
But really, Ruth, what I'd like to kind of start off with is the big picture, the idea of the importance of philanthropy sort of in your life, and how did you come to it? How do you think about it? Why is it important?
Well, thank you, and I will answer that question, but first I want to thank the Commonwealth Club and the Asia Society for having me here. I think both organizations do really important work of bringing views to the public at large, and I'm delighted to be on this platform offering my views tonight. So why is philanthropy in Asia important, and why is it important to me? It's important because I think most of you know that people refer to the 21st century as the Asian century. And that's some ambiguous term, although it's something, it's kind of the guiding star, that this is our time. And there's a sense when you're in Asia that this is our time. And if you lived 300 years from now and you look back at this time, this Asian century, we don't know yet if you'll think that was a good time to live on the planet Earth. That was a time in which there was opportunity, which people dealt with climate change, where there was education. The jury is out, but there's enormous potential to do good, not just in Asia, but Asians doing good around the world. And so I think that there's so much wealth being created there. There's such an opportunity to deploy it in ways that make a difference, not just in Asia, but around the world, that it's kind of this exciting opportunity to try to help that move along, accelerate it, and make it grow. So why it's important to me is because I feel truthfully that I feel like my whole life has led me to this moment, that everything I've done in my life has brought me to this place and created the network that I have, the understanding that I have, the tools to work with philanthropists to build an organization, the second one that I've built in Asia. So in some ways, it feels a little bit like destiny. And so here I am in San Francisco, talking about Asia, but living in Asia and working with amazing people throughout the region to really create the sea change that will bring the whole continent forward and really show models and strategies to the rest of the world as well.
That's great. So let me, just a bit of a detail before we get into the subject in a little more depth. CAPS, if I may say CAPS.
Please say CAPS.
Okay.
The name is too long otherwise.
Is I guess it's partly about education, it's partly about research, it's partly about sort of measuring progress and measuring, the do-good index. How would you describe the unfolding sort of mission of CAPS as it fits into that whole agenda?
So CAPS is the Center for Asian Philanthropy and Society, and that is the organization that I founded and run in Asia. And our mission is to improve the quantity and quality of philanthropy and other types of private social investment throughout Asia. And how are we doing that? The metaphor that I like to use is the cell phone metaphor. So we all know that cell phones are the quintessential leapfrog technology. And everybody says, what are the other leapfrog technologies that can be like cell phones? And why is it that cell phones took off in Asia more so than they did in the United States? Well, because there was not landline infrastructure in place, and because you didn't have a lot of vested interest attached to that landline infrastructure like we had in the United States, that kind of held it back. And I feel that could happen for social investment and philanthropy in Asia. There's not a lot of landline infrastructure in place. There aren't really organizations that help this. There's not rules that everybody, mores and systems that people follow. So if we could put in place the right ones, if we could educate people who are just starting to accumulate extraordinary wealth, but also the population at large, and governments, we can leapfrog in this sector, and that's what CAPS is trying to do. Work with both philanthropists and governments to put in place those mechanisms that will allow that money to be more impactful, more meaningful, and better spent.
That's cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what does that mean, really?
Well, I mean, to use the cell phone analogy,
Yeah.
it was about distributed communication.
Right, that's right.
So you're going to distribute the philanthropic.
We're going to raise
Motive.
all boats, yes.
Yeah. Right.
That's the goal.
Well, the book, we had a little discussion upstairs about the book. I've read it. It's a terrific book. Everybody should buy it. Ruth gave me one, but I'll buy another one. You know, to me, it's a marvelous encapsulation kind of all the things that you want to think about if you're thinking about philanthropy in Asia. But you say no, it's more based on kind of case studies.
And interviews with philanthropists and my 35 years
Yeah,
on the ground there.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, tell me how the case studies sort of fit into that you know, book thinking.
So when we were creating CAPS, we want to look at best practices, some strategies, models, and essentially I had a hypothesis, and the hypothesis was things are different here than the West. And I don't know how many of you have been in Asia, and look, probably many of you. 15 years ago, people would go to China particularly, but all over Asia, and say, let us show you how it's done in the United States. Let us show you how it's done in Europe. And the community would say, well, give them 10 or 15 years. They're going to be like us. And in fact, that didn't happen, right? Asia, while it's not monolithic, there's a lot of variation throughout the region, has evolved differently than Western Europe and the United States. And the thinking was that's probably true in the philanthropic and nonprofit sector as well. But we need to understand how those differences are manifesting themselves. What are the differences, and what can we learn about what they do better or differently? And when you can't talk about best practices and best models unless you know what's effective on the ground. So we looked at 30 very successful local nonprofits and social enterprises. We didn't pick, you know, like the Nature Conservancy in India. We picked only local organizations because they didn't have the toolkits that the international NGOs came with. And we wanted to know, why are these organizations successful? And what we found is that there's some pretty significant differences among the philanthropists and among those organizations that receive their money. And so the hypothesis was true, it was correct. And the book essentially is the findings from looking across all of those cases, from interviewing all of those donors, and from looking, you know, understanding how things work on the ground there.
Were there any really huge surprises?
Well, I think that the part that's not surprising when you look at the numbers is what we were just talking about, this extraordinary potential, and how people are just starting to really take advantage of it and kind of start exploring how to maximize that potential. So that wasn't a big surprise, but it's part of what gets me up in the morning and really exciting to be involved with it. I think that there are three kind of somewhat big findings. One is that Asian philanthropists up until this point have been more reactive than proactive. So what's happening in the United States, when you think about a lot of the very wealthy people, they say, here, I want to impact on this, right? Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan say, we want to eliminate all disease. And they hold a press conference to, right? This book is called Pragmatic.
And they have $3 billion to put on the table.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, so this is a book called Pragmatic Philanthropy. That's not the mindset of most of the people in Asia. They're not saying, I want to solve this big problem. They're thinking more incrementally and more pragmatically and reactively. You know, they react to an opportunity or a situation. Which brings me to the second point. They often react to the ask. because Asia is relationship-based, and you know that better than everyone. Jack has extraordinary relationships in Asia, which he has parlayed to very successfully, both personally and professionally.
Thank you.
Yes. I strive to emulate that. But relationships are important. They're the most important, and we can talk about some more what that means. But in terms of findings, that's the motivation often for giving. And when I go around and talk to Asian philanthropists, and I say, well, one of the findings is that the return on investment for philanthropy in Asia is enhanced relationships. I thought, with my Western lens, that they'd say, no, that's not true, And not one person says that. Yeah, of course. Tell me something I don't know. That's exactly the reason. So I suppose the acceptance of that truth surprised me a little bit. And then the other piece is something that motivates a lot of our work, and we can discuss at length, is something that I call the trust deficit. So when I went around and started interviewing these high and ultra high net worth individuals and ask them all, why don't you give more locally? Without exception, from Korea to Indonesia to India, pretty much everyone said, because I don't trust the local organizations to receive the money. So that trust deficit is really a disabling factor that's inhibiting the growth of the sector. So it's a big piece of what we're trying to deal with at CAPS, and how profound it is important. So I think many of you might know the story of Gua Mei Mei. I know this is being recorded for radio, but raise your hand if you've heard of her. Okay, well, let me tell you this story. In China, social media is a big thing, and everyone is on the Chinese equivalent of Twitter. Twitter is not available in China, but they're on it. And about 5 years ago, a young woman named Gua Mei Mei posted a picture of herself with her 2 babies. And one baby was a Lamborghini, and one baby was a Maserati. And Gua Mei Mei worked for the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was one of the few nonprofit organizations that was certified at the national level in China. And when she did that, donations to all organizations dropped, it's hard to tell exactly, but dropped by 90%. Because people thought, if I can't trust the Red Cross, and really the extent of the fraud must have been pretty significant, because you have to pay 100% taxes on that Lamborghini and the Maserati. So we're talking very big money. She was never prosecuted, never held accountable. She is no longer working for the Red Cross, however. But they have suffered. There are stories, not quite that sensational, but almost, in every Asian economy. And so, the kind of guilty until proven innocent. I don't trust the nonprofit sector, and then something like Gua Mei Mei happens. That's why. They're all corrupt. There must be fraud. And so, to the extent that is really hurting the sector, was somewhat of a surprise to me.
So actually, from the audience, here's a question that sort of relates to that.
Okay.
Because in part it deals with data and reporting and information and taxes.
Right.
Transparency, I guess, is the word.
That's the word.
How do they get there?
Well, I think all the governments should follow the findings that we came up with in the Doing Good Index. So this study was the first of its kind in the world, and it looks at the factors that enable and impede giving, philanthropy and private social investment. And we include regulations, tax and fiscal policies, procurement, and then something called ecosystem, which is about the people and the companies. Regulations can go a long way. Increasingly, governments are requiring that you have to submit your annual report. But there's not one government yet in Asia that requires those reports to be made public. In this country, we have GuideStar, but that's a voluntary effort which foundations put together, which is an invaluable resource in terms of accountability and transparency. GuideStar is trying to get a toehold in India and Korea now with limited success. So what's the problem here? Well, one of the problems is the nonprofit sector itself does not have the wherewithal to report. So you meet extraordinary people who have hearts of gold and are working really hard, but they don't have accounting skills. They don't know strategy. They don't know how to organizational management. They lack all those skills that are in every company, or should be in every company. So a real need is professionalizing the sector so that they can report. Those that do, not surprisingly, fundraise more because people can feel that they're trustworthy and they're better managed. They tend to have pretty savvy professionals running them. So there's an incumbency on the part of the organizations that receive the money, on the governments to put regulations into effect that require transparency and accountability, and really it's on the donor, which creates a little bit of a conflict. If your primary goal is enhanced relationship, or guanxi, the Chinese word, the minute you give the money, you've met your goal, right? So you're not asking for impact then, because you already know what that is. That is the relationship. So we need to be working also with the philanthropists to say, okay, you need to do that, and you need to ask these organizations to be better managed and report to you and to the community how they're spending the money and what the impact is.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, though, in a way, at least in China, where there has been historically an aversion to NGOs.
Right.
Okay, so you want to be a really good guy, you want to get a license, you want to be in a philanthropic organization, they won't give you a license.
Right.
So what do you do?
Well, I think that
Maybe that's changing.
kind of. So what? First of all, there is more and more acceptance. We use the term in our study SDO, Social Delivery Organization. Why? Because we're differentiating between an organization that delivers a social good versus an advocacy organization.
That's important. That's a big difference.
So Asian philanthropists and governments do not fund and support advocacy organizations. Just flat out. And when I say advocacy, there's different kinds of advocacy. If you're, I'll give you a story. There was an organization working on HIV/AIDS in Shanghai, and once the government decided that the number of people with HIV/AIDS was no longer a state secret, which for a long time it was, this organization figured out that the cocktail that the Chinese government was using was extremely ineffective compared to international drugs. And they went very quietly behind the scenes to the government and showed them the numbers. These are the people taking your medicines, these are the people taking international, and the people taking your medicines are dying. So the government listened. This was all behind the scenes. There was no press. There was nothing like that. And changed their policies. That kind of advocacy happens. What doesn't happen are advocacy groups like human rights, legal rights, LGBT rights, anything with the word rights. And so the donors don't want to support any organization that is going to take on or criticize their governments. They're all business people. So they fund social delivery organizations. So it would be helpful. In this country, we're supposed to, it's gotten a little bit mushy in the past few years, but we have 501c3s and 501c4s, and there's supposed to be a distinction between them. There is not one Asian country that has such a legal distinction. And this all feeds back to what? Measurement and transparency and accountability. I think that there's increased interest on it. And let me just say one other thing that's interesting here. China and India are the largest, obviously, by population. They have very different government structures. However, both...
That's an understatement.
Yes. Okay, so you have communism with Chinese characteristics and a free-for-all, somewhat quasi-democratic, very democratic in some way, government in India. Interestingly, both countries in the past few years have enacted two very broad sets of legislation and regulations with the same goals. So both of them, China with something called the International NGO Act, which is the Foreign Currency Regulations Act in India, is trying very hard not to allow foreign money into the country. Why? Because the foreigners fund things that the government may not like. And that's true in China and it's true in India. It is very difficult in both countries to receive money from outside. And it's only getting harder. Both countries also recently enacted laws to try to stimulate local giving. So China has something called the New Charity Law. It does have some more rules about reporting. It caps, I actually disagree with this, but it caps overhead to 10% regardless of the organization. It has very significant rules about who you're reporting to, how much you need, how often you need to check in with the agencies that you're connected to. India, it is now in year 4 of something called the CSR legislation. It's the only country in the world that requires essentially the top companies, anybody making a certain amount of revenue, to give 2% before tax to CSR.
Wow.
Huge money, huge money. And India is a mess, right? It's a very difficult country. The laws are, so they make this law, it's 2%. Tens of thousands of companies are required to give this, and there's just nothing in place to receive all of this money. So it's been a huge, very steep learning curve, but they're required to give it. The only way out of it, you can opt out of paying this money if you're one of the large Indian companies, but by putting on your website the reasons why you didn't felt you couldn't find sufficient need, which of course was actually kind of a brilliant move on the part of the government, because anybody who's been to India knows that you can't say that. Both of the countries are stimulating local, trying, which they can control more, which are more, tend to be aligned with what the government wants, and pushing back on foreign money, which is interesting given how different they are.
So that's a marvelous segue into this book, this study. In fact, I meant to encourage you to bring copies here for everybody. How did that, well, let me say, first of all, I mean, here's the story that Ruth is telling. This is my favorite chart in the whole book, because it ranks, 15 countries
Right.
by not doing enough, doing okay, doing better, doing well. And you made some people very happy and some people very mad, I'm sure.
Right. Well,
But I mean, this is the roadmap. I mean, as you begin to update this thing
that's
for
true.
these countries, as they want to think about what to do better.
And in
That's all.
fact, the idea came from, many of you may be familiar with the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report, which is released every other year, and really governments try to move up in that study. This was kind of the ease of doing good. What allows you or hinders you from giving? And it was a massive study. We partnered with 38 organizations. We polled 1,700 nonprofit organizations, 80 experts. The questionnaire had 150 questions on it, took an hour to fill out. It was translated into 11 languages to come up with this.
Good stuff.
Thank you, and it's
I
going to be.
love data.
Yeah, data is effective, and it's we're going to be redoing it every 2 years, and it's interesting. You know, Indonesia does very poorly in this. It's at the bottom with Myanmar, and Myanmar makes sense, right? It just came out of a military junta. There's no nonprofits, but Indonesia. Why? Why would it be so bad? You know, and there's really fundamental lack of infrastructure. In Indonesia, there's no such thing as a tax-exempt organization at all. And the tax incentives for individuals giving to nonprofit organizations in Indonesia is zero, no incentives whatsoever. So though that's pretty surprising given that Indonesia's a middle-income country at this point. So we are very fortunate that our donors really want they want this situation to be remedied, and we have a meeting with the Minister of Finance next month, actually, to talk about what they can be doing to improve the situation in Indonesia. In China, we'll probably wait till year 2. The next go around before really going public. And we can kind of do that because it's still too early. These new pieces of legislation I mentioned earlier are just so new that you really can't see yet the impact of them.
Here's a good question from the audience that's sort of in the same vein. What differences exist, if any, between philanthropy in countries at different levels of economic development? Is there any pattern? You just mentioned Indonesia, Japan. I mean, as I look at this list, it's kind of all over the lot.
Well, actually, we found that there is not a correlation between economic development and transparency and accountability of the sector. Very surprising, because you would assume otherwise. Now, the 3 economies that are doing the best are pretty sophisticated: Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore. But Korea, not so great. Hong Kong, not, and Vietnam does a lot better than Indonesia. It was surprising, and it's really it's actually great that we have that result, because then when governments say, well, you need to have more money than we have, we can say, well, no, actually, that's not the case. So it kind of takes away that escape clause for governments.
You know, the other thing that jumps out at me, Japan is very high on the list, but I think of Japan as a country that lacks a lot of entrepreneurial energy and therefore social entrepreneuring, which, you know, I sort of associate with philanthropy in a big way.
Right.
And yet they still come out at the top of the list.
Well, let me just say that in some ways this list is the distance needed to travel in order to be really good.
Okay.
So our scale was 5, no country surpasses 4. So even the ones who are doing the best can improve. Japan is probably the least philanthropic of all the countries we looked at. They have essentially a socialist government that provides most of the social services, and it is not a socially entrepreneurial or entrepreneurial place. Jack knows well because he lived there for many years. But a couple of things happened in Japan. One was the Kobe earthquake, followed by the tsunami and more recent disaster in Fukushima, and the desire of young people not to be what's called in Japan salarymen. People who get up in the morning, go to work, work for 10 hours for 40 years and die. That's essentially it had, the previous generations led very regimented lives where they worked for the same company their entire lives. Young people don't want that. So when these natural disasters happened, they said, wait a minute, I can start doing something. And I need to start doing something, and I don't want to just go work for Mitsubishi. So this is a moment in time for Japan to really switch things up. Young people want to. There's been these disasters which the government could not cope with the need generated after Kobe and after Fukushima. In fact, I don't know what the current statistic is, but 3 years after Fukushima, the Red Cross in Japan still had 50% of the donations because they just didn't have organizations they could deploy the money to. So I think that this is a time when there could be a chance for Japan to break out of that mindset and do something entrepreneurial, especially in this space.
Yeah. Here's another interesting question, sort of in the same vein. Do you think philanthropy can play a larger role in encouraging governments to positively engage with each other?
That is an interesting question, and one I haven't thought of yet. I can tell you that this is not really happening so much in Asia, but there are efforts to create huge funds, similar to, so Gavi, which is the association that's dealt with HIV/AIDS and different diseases, has been very successful. And so there's efforts by Rockefeller, by Gates, by a number of different organizations to create large funds to try to target specific issues, illnesses, problems. If those funds will force governments to work together. Yeah. Those funds aren't getting much traction in Asia, but they're trying. They are getting a lot of traction elsewhere in the world.
Perish the thought, is one belt, one road philanthropy?
No.
No.
But, okay.
But.
There's a but. Okay, so One Belt, One Road is China's Marshall Plan on steroids. I think it's fair to say. So China is deploying billions and billions and billions. One Belt, One Road is across the old Silk Road and then also the sea channels to create infrastructure basically throughout a good portion of the world. They are trying to deploy Chinese nonprofits also along the One Belt, One Road system. So it's just starting, but that they recognize that nonprofits are a type of soft power, and so the Chinese government is funding Chinese nonprofits to go and do work along the One Belt, One Road system. So but that's just starting. It's early days.
Could you, again, off into the wild blue yonder, can you imagine a CAPS organized conference that would talk about this stuff with these 15 countries in the room? I mean, there are plenty of examples of areas where in Asia there are cooperative conversations. And it just occurs to me that philanthropy, as far as I know, kind of doesn't have a place like that.
Jack, if you fund that,
Oh, I stuck my foot in my mouth. I got Ken right here.
I'm with you.
let's talk. I think though that obviously many issues today are not, they don't stop at the border, right? So health issues, education issues, we wouldn't have so many refugees if there weren't economic, and certainly climate change. So there is increased need to work together. And philanthropy in Asia is really just beginning, but we do know that business people have an extraordinary degree of influence. And they are, I mean, this is a part of the world where crony capitalism was really strong. I mean, there are very close relationships, not as much anymore. Things have really changed, but there's close relationships between businesses and government, and therein lies some opportunity. One of the great models that I think really emanates from Asia and kind of can speak to what you're getting at is, so a very big difference between what happens in Asia and the United States is the role of government almost every step of the way. I write in the book that there is a social contract in place. In some places, as it's explicit, you must partner with government in China, but it's always implicit. Government and companies work together. So what's the good news about that is that when a nonprofit organization or a social entrepreneur or social enterprise comes up with an innovation, the government is already there. So they can pick up that innovation and really, incorporate it for system change. Here, what we've always done is create model projects and hope that the government sees what's effective and picks it up. Well, in Asia, they're working together from the beginning. So it lends itself much more readily to systemic change. And one of the points I made in my last book on social entrepreneurship is I think that there's a little bit too much focus on scale and not enough on system change. Systemic change is what we want. Scale is a lot more Band-Aids oftentimes. So, but in order to have system change, you have to have the government involved. Otherwise, it's not systemic. So the government's involved from the get-go in most of these innovations and interventions in Asia.
Yeah. So what is a good place to ask, what about the difference between personal philanthropy and corporate philanthropy? You talk about that in your book.
Yeah, although it's changing and it's not true everywhere, in most Asian economies, families still dominate most companies. So families make decisions about a company's CSR. Many families route all their funding through the corporation. For example, there's the wealthiest Indonesian family is the Hartono family. It's called Jarum Company, and Jarum Foundation is the foundation of Jarum Company. They don't have a separate foundation. So the overlap between family and corporate is significant in Asia. There's still family-dominated decisions around CSR. Having said that, it's okay. I think that it's just a different way of doing things. But I would like to point out some kind of trends when it comes to CSR. Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
So, and I'll end with one that I worry about a little bit. So, one trend that's very positive is that companies are realizing that point which we talked about earlier, that nonprofits or social delivery organizations really just don't have business skills at all. So a number of companies are saying, we'll give you money, but only if you also take technical assistance. And so I give a number of examples of that in the book, but one from Malaysia is Mercy Malaysia. This was a few doctors who were concerned about crisis situations, especially in Muslim countries. They started organizing during the Bosnia, and they felt that they had something to add because they were Muslim doctors and there were a lot of problems in Muslim countries. And, but they didn't know how to organize at all, and they were essentially adopted by the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, not the notorious one, the good one, but Khazanah, which essentially helped Mercy Malaysia become a top-notch disaster recovery organization in the medical field by providing them with all the skill sets they need in order to professionalize. So that's an important trend. Another trend, though, that I see that's starting to happen is what I call DIY philanthropy, or do-it-yourself philanthropy. Because a number of these companies don't trust local nonprofit organizations, they say, we don't need to go through them. We don't need to fund these organizations. We've got project management, we've got distribution systems, we know what the issues are. We can go and do this ourselves. And while the goal may be achieved, what it does then is starve the nonprofit organizations. And this notion of companies doing it themselves, that's really proliferating. So I'll give an example. It's actually a nice example, not a negative, but I mean, they are doing good, it's just without working through a nonprofit. In Myanmar, 70% of the country still does not have electricity. So the biggest company, the biggest non-military company in Myanmar is Yoma Ventures. They have as many Yoma Bank, Yoma Ventures. And they decided to go into these villages and just select a football pitch and put in solar powered LED lights at night. And they've done this in about 1,000 villages now. And what does that do? Well, all of a sudden, kids can do their homework, people are trading, there's more companies coming out of it because people can meet. There's all kinds of chess tournaments and book clubs because they have something so basic as a lit space at night, which has really endeared them to the communities in which where they're doing this. And they're being even more strategic. They go to the villages of their own employees. So their employee gets to be very much big man on campus because it's because of this employee that this project is being brought, the light is being brought. The employee is even more grateful to the company in which he or she works. The village benefits, and everyone thinks very highly of Yoma. It just means they're not working through another organization.
And they are saying something about sustainability, which is not all bad.
No.
Which brings me to another question from the audience about climate change and sustainability. before I ask that question, let me just refer to one of the references in the book, and I don't know, well, actually, let me go here first. You say in China, there is a new charity law that limits the work of SDOs to poverty relief, care for the elderly, orphans, disaster relief, education, science, culture, and sports. What's missing?
Yeah. Although there are some, because the environment is such a big issue,
Yeah.
there's efforts in that anyway, and
Anyway,
they manage to find loopholes around that.
Yeah.
This is the government of China trying to control philanthropy, where the money's going, right?
Yeah.
But they are supportive of some environmental groups, and there's some that have sprouted up, especially consortium of business leaders that have created funds to deal with
Yeah.
climate.
Okay, so, I mean, the question is there a systematic movement in Asia to link philanthropy with solutions to climate change?
So, one of my board members is on the global board of World Resources Institute, and bemoans how there's really almost no philanthropic capital going to environmental groups in Asia. Partially because the problem seems too big. They can't, they're very incremental thinkers. They're trying to do something relatively small, and how do you address climate change? They don't know how. There isn't that much organized. There's these two new organizations. The Sea Foundation is one of them in China. But other than that, there's very little going on in terms of local funding for environmental or climate change related activities.
And I guess it's assumed, I mean, if you can't breathe in Beijing, which was sort of the case last year, it's getting a little bit better.
Right,
You assume the government's gonna fix it.
and the government has been,
Working on it.
right,
Right.
trying to,
Yeah.
right. But also, I mean, as a philanthropist, you can't close down those factories.
Yeah, right.
Right, so, you have to, they're thinking, what is it that I can do? We worked with one conglomerate in Southeast Asia that is a power company, power generation and distribution, and they use coal. And we helped them with their CSR. Really, we did a workshop, we did a board retreat to help them reassess what their CSR strategy is. And I said, you guys are a power company, and yet you're not doing anything when it comes to the environment. How can that be? And the truth was, they were kind of embarrassed that they know they're the culprit. They've got coal plants. So they were trying to hide, essentially. And part of the reason we were brought in is because you can't hide anymore. I mean, it's harder and harder, right? Everyone knows coal is bad. And people have, breathing problems where there's coal plants. So I think that this company is still going to use coal because it's cheaper, but they're doing more and more on renewables and more on environmental education, and essentially saying, we know there's a problem and we're working with you to try to fix it, which is new.
There are three American organizations, the Energy Foundation, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and the Rocky Mountain Institute,
Right,
who actually bizarrely do have offices
Right.
in China,
Right.
and they have somehow miraculously kind of been accepted. I mean, they've been at it a long time, but it's not one of those cases where foreigners come in and tell them what to do. It's that they have been acknowledged to be constructive.
that's
Yeah,
true, and the government has embraced those
Yeah.
three, but private money is not going particularly to those three from Asia.
From Asia, no,
Right.
it's coming from here.
It's coming, so there
Yeah.
are, right, there's examples of that, right, where it's the World Resources Institute, I just met with their head of global operations, and they have 90 people in India, and something like 75% of their budget comes from outside of India, which is extraordinary because, yes, India is very poor, but India has some very, very deep pockets also. And they could be funding that, but they're not.
You know, another crazy thing, not to go off on a tangent, but Teach for India, Teach for China. I mean, very curious success stories of an American idea, obviously, that is now totally funded, the last time I checked locally.
Right. Well, they did something very smart. They created a, they incorporated locally.
Yeah.
They have a local board. I mean, that's part of their, of Teach for All is the umbrella organization that Wendy Kopp created. But Teach for Philippines is very different than Teach for India, which is very different than Teach for Japan, except that they're all bringing young people into the education system. So that part is similar. But the curricula that they use and the way that they go about it and what they're recruiting is quite different, and their funding is all local.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they become local organizations, right?
So I can't resist asking this question. How is Asian philanthropy affected by regime change?
You know,
Yeah.
well,
Or the lack of it.
I mean, I think that that's the reason that China and India are trying to control Indonesia has put in place laws holding back on funding. In their case, money was going to essentially right-wing Islamist groups, and money out of Saudi Arabia, just slightly different. But I mean, I think that governments in Asia are worried that foreign sources are working toward regime change and trying very hard to not let that happen. But I can tell you that I don't know any Asian donor who funds organizations with the mission of regime change.
I hope not.
Well, the one exception I would say is that during the dictatorship years in Korea, a lot of very large membership-based nonprofit organizations that are advocacy, that's all, to take down the dictator, were created. So when you use the term NGO in Korea, people think you're talking about anti-government entities. These are people out there with placards marching. So it has a very different connotation in that one place.
So we're getting near the end, and this is not really a part of your book or your research, but it's a curiosity that's important, I think, to everybody in the room. How is philanthropy different in Asia compared to the rest of the world? I mean, that's...
So when you look at the early writings about philanthropy in this country, let's just look at this country. I mean, this is kind of, the United States is the best in class when it comes to philanthropic giving. We give them the most. It's equivalent to 2% of our GDP, which is the highest in the world. It's been a fundamental source and component of a pluralistic government, or governance system, right? People being engaged, nonprofit organizations, philanthropy, that is part of pluralism. Okay, well, that's not the motivating that's not what's happening in Asia. In Asia, it's really about compassion, humanity, people helping people, but not about the governance structure. It's much more kind of lower down on Maslow's hierarchy. You're helping other people because they're hungry or they're sick or they need education. So I would say that it's more humanitarian than political. But that's a huge, broad statement, and of course there's exceptions. Yeah.
I guess where we see the huge differences, at least in America compared to, well, the rest of the world, is in private academic institutions that, you know, we have grown to love and cherish, that are totally privately funded, and the rest of the world kind of
Doesn't have that. Even,
Doesn't have-
even the UK, right, doesn't really have it.
Yeah.
So it's been one of the great challenges for CAPS, because we are a research organization, and when you ask a donor in Asia to fund research, they say, why? You know, government funds research. Why would I fund it unless it's Harvard and I get a lot of face, or it's my alma mater. But research as a goal, as an objective, is something important to fund. It's part of our job is to help philanthropists really understand why that's helpful to them, and why it's helpful not only to have the government voice when it comes to doing research, independent research. But it is true that you don't have these private universities.
Do you detect in what you're doing that there is some private fundraising starting to take place at the great academic institutions in Asia?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, our chairman gave $350 million to Harvard, and now the School of Public Health is the Chan School of Public Health. And every university in China and in Hong Kong comes knocking on his door and says, hey, you know, what about us? We're right here.
But that's offshore. I mean, you got the Schwartzman scholars that.
No, but I mean.
I guess, you know, Hong Kong counts.
No, but I'm just saying,
They
those,
wake up
those Asian universities are asking those people to fund, absolutely. And if you go around University of Hong Kong, you will see the you know, the Li Ka-shing building and the Kadoorie building and the, you know, other buildings that are endowed by wealthy people in
Yeah.
that.
But we don't see the Jack Ma building anywhere yet.
No, supposedly he's building his own university.
Oh, yeah.
And Jack Ma, of course, is the founder of Alibaba, and, you know, probably the wealthiest mainland Chinese, but the wealthiest Indian is also building his own university.
Is that right?
And he's a Stanford alum. That's his, you know, Stanford Business School alum. So he has that vision. Yeah. So we'll see. There are private universities being built now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't think about, okay, instead of giving to Tsinghua, you build your own.
Right.
But I guess that's how Harvard started, right?
Right. And Stanford.
In Stanford.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Long time ago.
Right. Got to start sometime.
Right. Okay, here are my last two questions from the audience,
Okay.
and let me do them together. How will you know when you've done good, when you've accomplished what you set out to do, question mark, and how can we follow in your footsteps and have such an interesting career like you do?
Oh my God. Well, the first two is I don't think I'll ever feel satisfied. I mean, this is the minute we have a great success, I'm kind of thinking about, and as my friends and family will tell you, worried about the next thing that I need to be working on, which is the downside of, I think, being a kind of a social entrepreneur, is that you keep being driven by worry. So I don't know that I wish that on anyone, actually, but it is very interesting. I think that there's plenty of opportunity to try to make the world a better place, and I just feel fortunate that somehow we're gathering momentum and really starting to resonate with people who have the wherewithal to do enormous good and haven't quite stepped up to the plate yet. And if we can get some of them to do that, and I think we're starting to, that would be hugely satisfying. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's it's starting to happen, and I feel very lucky, and I encourage you to look at our website, www.caps.org. That study that Jack mentioned is there, downloadable for free. All of our research is free because that's the mission of the organization.
The clock reads 0. I'm so proud of you. And I'm not used to the rigor with which the Commonwealth Club ends its sessions. So I'm going to read so I don't make a mistake.
Okay.
Our thanks to Dr. Ruth Shapiro, founder and chief executive of CAPS, and the author of the new book, Pragmatic Philanthropy. Also, we thank everyone who has come, the audience here on the radio, television, and the internet. This program has been held in association with the Asia Society of Northern California. We want to remind everyone that Dr. Shapiro's book is for sale outside, and that she will be signing them. I'm Jack Wadsworth, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club, the place where people, the place where you're in the know, is adjourned. And I'm told now
Yeah.